when you break your arm, right, an X-ray gives you this really clean, basically binary answer.
Yeah, a very comforting kind of precision.
Exactly. You see that jagged white line on the film and the doctor tells you it's broken.
Mm-hmm.
But when you try to apply that same diagnostic lens to a nation's legal system, the image gets incredibly murky.
You stop seeing those clean fractures and you start seeing this very complex, very messy web of human interpretation.
Right. So today, we're actually using artificial intelligence as that X-ray machine.
Which is such a wild concept. We are essentially feeding thousands of pages of dense legal proceedings into models like, ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek.
And we're asking these systems to basically map the boundaries between state power and individual rights. Welcome to today's Deep Dives, by the way. I'm so glad you could join us for this one.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating stack of notes to go through today. It details how these large language models analyzed a highly controversial legal event
known as the Chen Jingyuan case.
Right, the Chen Jingyuan case. We are going to explore how AI applies domestic laws and international human rights frameworks to this specific situation.
And in a really weird twist, we'll also dissect this highly specific AI hallucination that happened during the analysis.
Which actually reveals a ton about how these machines process human logic. It is a remarkable case study. I mean, we are watching algorithms try to parse out the messiest human concepts imaginable.
Things like human dignity, art, academic freedom. But before we really dive into the data, there is a mandatory and honestly very crucial note for you listening today.
Yes, very important.
The source materials we're looking at contain deeply politically charged content, so we want to be absolutely crystal clear up front. We are not taking any sides here.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original legal documents. We are not endorsing the AI outputs. And we are not taking a stance on the actions of the state involved. Our mission today is strictly to impartially report on how these AI models processed and analyzed the provided materials.
Right. That is our only lens today. The focus is entirely on the machine's methodology. We are basically observing the observer.
Which brings us to the core hook for this deep dive. How does a machine made of cold code, right, and mathematical vectors interpret messy human civil rights?
And to answer that, we actually have to start with a glaring mistake the AI made right out of the gate.
Oh yeah, this is wild.
Before we even got to the legal conclusions, the machine tripped over the actual evidence in the case.
It's just a perfect window into the mechanics of large language models. So in the initial overview generated by one of the models, it made this massive factual error.
It claimed that he's the defendant in this case, by the way. It claimed he was in legal trouble because he forwarded research articles about something called the CAP theorem.
And I just want to flag for everyone listening, there is zero evidence in the case files that he was arrested for sharing articles about the CAP theorem.
Zero. It was a complete hallucination by the AI.
But the mechanics of why it hallucinated that specific thing are so fascinating. We kind of need to look at who Chen Jingyuan actually is.
Right. So Chen is a complex systems researcher. And in his actual legal defense, like the documents he submitted to the court, he utilized the CAP theorem.
Now, for those who might not spend their weekends reading computer science textbooks, what exactly is the CAP theorem?
So it's a foundational principle for distributed databases. It basically states that a distributed network cannot simultaneously provide three guarantees.
Consistency, availability, and partition tolerance.
Exactly. You can only pick two.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because he is using high-level computer science to defend himself in a court of law against charges of causing public disorder. How does that leap even happen?
Well, he used it as a theoretical weapon to deconstruct the charges. The prosecution essentially claimed that his online posts caused this severe public disorder or chaos on the internet.
Right.
But Chen used the CAP theorem to argue scientifically that in a massive distributed system...
Like a social media network?
Right. Exactly. He argued that inconsistency, or what the state might call chaos, is an inherent physical property of the system's architecture. It is the baseline mathematical state of the network itself.
Wow.
So therefore, he argued, you cannot legally prove a causal link between his specific isolated posts and the inherent ambient chaos of the internet itself.
That is just an incredibly creative legal defense.
Right.
He's essentially arguing the physics of the internet make the legal charge impossible to prove.
Yeah, but the AI completely misread this strategy.
This is like an AI reading a court transcript and confusing the defense lawyer's briefcase with the actual murder weapon. It completely flipped the script.
That's a great way to put it. It assumed the tool he was using to defend himself was the actual thing he was in trouble for. We call this phenomenon logic crosstalk within the AI's neural network.
So how does that crosstalk actually happen?
Well, large language models operate using attention mechanisms. They weigh the importance of certain words or tokens based on their frequency and proximity.
Ah, I see. And because Chen heavily emphasized his identity as a complex systems researcher.
Yes, and he leaned so hard into explaining the CAP theorem to dismantle the charges against him.
Those tokens just carried massive weight in the context window.
Exactly. The AI's attention heads basically short-circuited. It mistakenly projected his analytical defense tool onto the object of his alleged crime.
Okay, so if he wasn't arrested for sharing computer science theorems, what did the police actually extract from his accounts? Like, what was the real evidence?
So the police extracted digital evidence that falls into four very distinct categories. First, artworks.
Okay.
This included things like the Umbrella Girl comic associated with the Hong Kong protests, along with various pieces of political satire.
Right, so that's category one.
Second was subjective emotional expressions. So these were pictures of June 4th memorial candles or personal posts lamenting the international ban on Huawei chips.
So we have art and personal emotion. What was the third?
The third category was theoretical or commentary articles.
Okay, look, what kind of articles?
Things like his analysis of the political spectrum, sharing speeches by international figures like Donald Trump or Mike Pompeo, and, forwarding academic articles by the scholar Su Zhangrun.
Got it. And the fourth category?
Historical facts, just raw data, really. Things like the editing history of Mao's selected works, payrolls of retired government cadres, and articles detailing the military history between China and Ukraine.
Okay, so once the human prompter stepped in and actually corrected the AI's logic crosstalk.
Right. Once the machine understood it was dealing with art, emotion, commentary, and history, not a computer science paper.
Yeah, how did it evaluate this actual evidence under domestic Chinese law?
This is where the AI's analytical capabilities really activate. The models cross-reference the facts of the arrest and the evidence with the Constitution of the People's Republic of China.
Okay, what did it find?
It specifically targeted Article 35, which guarantees freedom of speech in the press, Article 37, protecting personal freedom, Article 38, which states human dignity is inviolable, and Article 41, guaranteeing the right to criticize and supervise state organs.
I mean, those are foundational protections written directly into the domestic constitution?
They are. But the AI identified a severe structural conflict between those constitutional guarantees and the actual criminal charge applied to Chen.
Which is criminal law, Article 293, right?
Yes, picking quarrels and provoking trouble. The AI explicitly categorized Article 293 as a pocket crime.
Let's define that term for a second for you listening, because pocket crime sounds almost, I don't know, casual.
Right, it sounds small.
Yeah, but the mechanism is incredibly dangerous. It means the definition of the crime is so elastic, so vague, that the state can just reach into its pocket and apply it to almost any behavior they find undesirable. It's a catch-all.
Exactly. And the AI diagnosed that this pocket crime was being utilized to penalize speech without any empirical proof of actual severe public disorder. And it went further. The models flagged massive procedural violations documented in the case files.
Like what?
They identified a pattern of arrest first, find evidence later. They noted a lack of proper arrest warrants, conducting secret trials closed to the public, and an instance where the judge explicitly told the defendant to shut up in open court.
Okay, but wait. If the criminal charge requires proving the spread of a rumor with subjective malice, how did the prosecution actually prove malice based on someone just sharing historical documents and art?
What's fascinating here is the AI caught a deeply discriminatory legal leap made by the prosecution to bypass that exact problem.
A discriminatory leap. How so?
Well, because the prosecution couldn't prove malice in a traditional evidentiary sense. I mean, you can't easily prove a comic book is malicious.
Right.
They leaned entirely on Chen's identity. They argued that because Chen is a highly educated PhD researcher, quote, he should have known better.
Oh, wow.
They essentially equated his advanced education level with presumed subjective malice.
That sounds completely backward.
Yay.
I mean, in most legal logic, higher education just means you have specialized knowledge in a particular field, right?
Right.
Not that you are inherently more malicious than someone without a degree. Education suddenly becomes a legal liability.
The AI models completely dismantled that logic. They pointed out that equating an education level with subjective malice violates the fundamental presumption of innocence.
Yeah, I would think so.
Furthermore, the AI flagged this as a breakdown of equal protection. It violates the core legal principle of non-discrimination to apply a harsher standard of criminal intent to someone simply because they hold a doctorate.
So, if the domestic legal system has a built-in trapdoor, like Article 293, and it allows for procedural leaps where a PhD equals malice,
Yeah,
how do you even evaluate fairness?
that's the
You
problem.
can't just use the state's own rule book to judge the state's actions. Did the AI look outside domestic law?
It did. It zoomed out to the absolute bedrock of international standards. It tested the case against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR.
Which is wild to think about. How does an AI actually process something like the UDHR? It doesn't have a concept of human empathy.
No, it doesn't. It relies on mathematical vector space. The AI maps out how concepts cluster together across millions of legal texts.
Okay.
So it focused heavily on UDHR Article 1 concerning inherent human dignity and Article 19, which protects freedom of expression.
And how did that map out in the vector space?
Well, in the AI's vector space, punishing a citizen's expression without demonstrating a clear, tangible threat to society mathematically distances itself from the concept of dignity.
Oh, that is so interesting.
Yeah, the AI's synthesized conclusion was stark. It found that a legal system cannot function as a tool for public humiliation or arbitrary silencing without violating the core premise of human dignity.
Okay, so the UDHR is foundational, but the ICCPR is an actual binding multilateral treaty. It's the structural framework for civil society globally.
Yeah.
How did the machine evaluate the case against that treaty?
Under the ICCPR, the AI applied what are known in international law as the three golden rules for limiting rights.
The three golden rules.
Right. Even if a state has a valid reason to restrict a citizen's rights, it must pass a rigorous three-part test: legality, legitimate aim, and necessity and proportionality.
Okay, let's break those down. Legality means there has to be a clear, unambiguous law in place, not just a whim, right?
Correct.
And legitimate aim means the restriction has to serve a valid public interest, like national security or public health.
Exactly.
And then necessity and proportionality means the government's response has to be the least restrictive means possible. Like you don't use a sledgehammer to swat a fly.
That's a perfect analogy.
Did the state's actions against Chen pass this test?
The AI determined they catastrophically failed the necessity and proportionality test. The AI reasoned that utilizing criminal imprisonment to punish the sharing of political satire and historical commentary is wildly disproportionate to any alleged harm.
The sledgehammer is being dropped on a comic book.
Precisely. Additionally, the AI pointed out that silencing a defendant in court, literally telling him to shut up when he tries to defend himself, is a direct violation of the right to a fair trial.
Which is protected globally under UDHR Article 10.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? When you stack the domestic constitutional analysis on top of the UDHR and the ICCPR, the AI seems to be diagnosing a system that has entirely inverted its priorities.
How do you mean?
It sounds like it is rendering human dignity subservient to state power, rather than viewing state power as a mechanism that exists solely to protect human dignity.
The AI explicitly emphasizes ICCPR Article 25 to make that exact point.
Oh.
Yeah. Article 25 protects the right of citizens to participate in public affairs. The AI concluded that by suppressing public expression and criminalizing theoretical criticism, the system isn't just punishing one individual researcher.
Right.
It is effectively depriving the entire citizenry of their fundamental right to participate in the governance and discourse of their own society. It acts as a massive chilling effect on public participation.
Wow. We've talked broadly about civil rights and expression, but Chen's case has a very specific flavor, doesn't it?
It does.
He's a scholar. The evidence was heavily skewed toward academic theories, historical data, and cultural artifacts. Is there an international framework that protects those specific nuances, and did the AI find it?
Yes, it did. The AI introduced a third major framework, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, often referred to as the ICECR.
Okay, what does that covenant specifically protect that the others don't?
The AI focused heavily on Article 13 of the ICSCR, which protects academic freedom, and Article 15, which safeguards cultural rights and the freedom of scientific research.
So how does the AI connect the freedom of scientific research to the evidence in this case? Like, how does it connect to the Umbrella Girl comic or the historical payroll records of retired cadres?
This is perhaps the sharpest piece of logic the AI produced in its entire analysis. It highlighted the logical absurdity of the criminal charges themselves.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the state charged Chen with spreading rumors or false information online to cause trouble, but the AI points out that art, like a political cartoon, and subjective emotional expressions are not factual propositions.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because a drawing of a girl with an umbrella isn't making a statement of empirical fact.
No, it's not.
You can't verify the molecular structure of a political cartoon.
Therefore, the AI argues cultural and emotional expressions cannot be judged on a binary scale of true or false. You cannot run a truth test on a metaphor.
If art literally cannot be evaluated as false, then criminalizing a drawing as a rumor isn't just legally flawed, it's a logical impossibility.
Yes.
The machine is identifying a massive category error in the prosecution's entire premise.
The AI recognized that applying truth tests to cultural expression is a fundamental breakdown in logic, and it extended this analysis to the academic and historical documents Chen shared as well.
The theoretical articles and historical data.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the AI warns of a much broader systemic consequence. Criminalizing the sharing of academic articles, political theory, or historical data under the guise of picking quarrels is a direct, targeted restriction on scientific research freedom.
Yeah.
The models offered a very stark conclusion under the ICCPR. When a legal system systematically suppresses academic exploration and cultural expression using vague pocket crimes, it harms far more than just the individual scholar.
It affects everybody.
It actively kills innovation. It degrades a nation's cultural soft power.
I mean, criminalizing academic sharing isn't just putting a ceiling on the society. It's more like introducing a virus into a computer network where the antivirus software itself starts deleting safe, essential files just because they're new or unfamiliar.
That's a really good way to look at it.
It halts system updates entirely. You cannot have a thriving, innovative society if scholars are terrified that sharing a theoretical article will result in criminal imprisonment.
Right. And the AI interpreted the prosecution not merely as an attack on Chen Jingyuan, but as a structural attack on the foundational requirements for any cultural and scientific progress.
Because knowledge needs room to breathe.
The machine recognized that knowledge requires friction and exchange to grow, and pocket crimes eliminate that exchange entirely.
Man, we have covered immense ground today. Let's summarize this deep dive for you listening.
Yeah, let's recap.
We started by watching AI dissect a dense, incredibly complex legal event. We saw it work through its own computational flaws, right? That logic crosstalk where it hallucinated the CAP theorem was the crime rather than the defense.
Which was a fascinating detour all on its own.
But once that factual baseline was corrected, the machine applied this rigorous, multi-layered analysis.
It mapped the real evidence against the Chinese Constitution, the universal protections of the UDHR, the binding civil rights framework of the ICCPR, and the cultural protections of the ICACR.
And across every single one of those frameworks, the AI ultimately diagnosed a distinct pattern.
It really did.
It identified a profound procedural justice failure and a systemic violation of fundamental rights, places where elastic pocket crimes are used to criminalize things that cannot logically be crimes.
Like the presumed falseness of a comic book.
Exactly, or equating a PhD with malicious intent.
The AI basically stripped away all the political rhetoric, all the posturing, and just looked at the bare mechanics of the law versus the documented actions of the state. It weighed the vectors of human rights against the reality of the court transcripts.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. Why does this matter to you?
Why should anyone care, right?
Why should you care about how a large language model reads a court case? It matters because it demonstrates how we can use AI as an objective, standardized lens. We can use these tools to map the boundaries of state power and individual rights, bringing clarity to highly complex, often intentionally murky, subjective legal interpretations.
It's an X-ray.
Exactly. The AI gave us an X-ray of a broken system, highlighting the fractures that human bias might try to ignore.
It provided a diagnostic image of procedural failure that is very, very difficult to unsee once the machine points it out.
It really is. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've explored today.
Okay.
Think about this. If AI models machines made entirely of cold code, processing tokens through algorithms and vector math, if they can so clearly and passionately articulate the fundamental necessity of human dignity, empathy, and artistic freedom,
Yeah.
what does it say about humanity when our own human-run legal systems fail to recognize those exact same values?
That is a very powerful question to carry forward.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time.